Jones, talking about the Underground Railroad in Schoharie County. Ken is president of the Esperance Historical Society and Museum and serves as the town historian. He also serves as president of the Esperance Cemetery Association and past chairman of the Commission of Archives and History of the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. Ken's a life member and former chairman of the board of trustees of the Schoharie County Historical Society. He's written several books. He works part-time at University of Albany SUNY and for an online company providing training in the area of procurement. Ken has written several books on local history, and he has some with him today. I think that he will be signing afterwards. For anybody who's interested, we also have them available at the fort when we are open, which will be the May 3rd date of the next speaker is also the date when the fort will open for the season. So with that, I'll turn this program over to Ken. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mark. A friend of mine, the late Mark Sullivan, we used to have debates. He says there wasn't any Underground Railroad at New And I says, well, you gotta, you know, because he was a great researcher on his own, especially the Revolutionary period and that kind of stuff. But, you know, they didn't leave behind any kind of, you know, written history because what they're doing is basically frowned upon or illegal or both. So they're, you know, you have to find little breadcrumbs and follow them along. But what you find also is that there are, you know, resources, but they're hard to find until you know what you want to look for. So we're going to be talking about possible routes of the Underground Railroad, people that were involved in the abolitionist movement, slavery in Schoharie County a little bit, and we'll you know, end with some of the locations of where we think some of the safe houses might have been. There's a lot more that can be uncovered. This is just what I was able to discover when I offered to do a program in Sharon for their historical group on the Underground Railroad. I've done quite a bit of history research on Black history in the county. The book on the table there, Sam's a Gallows Bird, is about a black man from Schoharie County. It was hung for murder in Fonda. And in doing that, I had to do a lot of research that took quite a bit of looking for original materials. And luckily, I had a lot of people that had them and were sharing with me. This you see is an earlier map of Schoharie County. We're going to be talking about some of the areas to do with, if you look at the map, you'll see Schoharie County borders a lot of other counties. So our history overflows into those other counties. So today we're going to talk about mainly Schoharie and Schenectady, Albany, Montgomery, and a little bit, I think, Greene is in there as well in the story that we're going to hear today. If you read Sims' History of Schoharie County, one of the early county histories, it's been reprinted, and you can probably buy a copy here at the fort. This is what Sims has to say in 1845. It says, the Germans, when they located at Schoharie, owned no slaves, nor indeed did they for several years, but these accompanied the Dutch, like the Romans, on their arrival as part of their gear. By industry and a proper husbandry of what the earth produced, the wealth of the former increased rapidly. It was not long before they too possessed them. The manner in which the slaves of Schoharie were generally treated by their masters is not inaptly described by Mrs. Grant in her Memoirs of Albany. They were allowed freedom of speech and indulged in many things which other members of the family were, whose age corresponded to their own. And to a superficial spectator, had the color not interfered, they would have seen inequality. So that was Sims' version of what slavery was like in Schoharie County. What you have to keep in mind is the Dutch did have a different way of dealing with blacks before the English took over New York. That they had a higher level of authority as a person, where when the English came, they became property. So there was a difference in the way the Dutch treated their slaves and the way the English did. But as far as, they were having a great time, and as a member of the family, that's a little bit of the stretch. This is a will at the signature of John Peter Niskern, who was the founder of Niskern Store, which is in Central Bridge area, Esperance town where I'm from. And if you read his will, he did this in 1746 because there was going to be a war, and he wasn't sure he was going to come back. So he made his last will and testament, but if you read it, there's no slaves in that will. And there's also, I don't think there were any wheeled wagons. In other words, they were pretty poor still by this point, and but they were farmers, but they had no slaves at this point. This is a later sale of a slave, and it's from 1774, and it's between Peter Broman and Josiah Stewart. And what is interesting, it's just like in a very expensive racehorse or what have you, you may have multiple owners. So this particular slave and her son were owned in a partnership by 3 people. So 3 people in partnership owned this particular slave. And Josiah Stewart was, I believe, the one who was Peter Broman was present. Yeah, 1,700. Let's see. Convention, selling his part of the Negro slave to Cornelius Broman. So Cornelius Broman is buying 1/3 of the slave and her son. So this is what William Roscoe, he wrote The History of Schoharie County in 1882. This is what he said about slavery in Schoharie County. The Negroes of both sexes were admitted into the family to which they belonged upon equal footing, while the white members were the white members, and appreciated the kindness shown to them by their masters. So their masters were all kind. This is a little different story. This is about the Peter Broman house, which is just down the road here from the fort and near the bridge, the covered bridge right here in Schoharie. It says, some say that ghosts of the past walked in the old Broman house, one of the county's show places, for one of the women in Peter's household, in a fit of temper, once pushed a slave girl down the cellar steps. As the slave fell, she struck her head on masonry and died. So I guess they weren't all treated as a member of the family. The Underground Railroad, I just read something recently. The term Underground Railroad, when did we have railroads, right? What years? Late 1830s, right? 1840s. So the Underground Railroad is relatively recent. It's not like nobody ran away from slavery before then and waited for the train to come. It wasn't that way at all. So here's one from 1774, where a Negro man named Graham has run away, and John Baker is putting an advertisement in here, and he says, if you deliver him to Jacob C. Tonight, who happens to be one of the owners of the Tonight Patent, he is an Albany merchant. Tonight Patent is where Esperance is, ironically. And they're saying that, usually they advertise this so that if the slave did something bad, they weren't responsible, because they let everybody know, hey, he's run away, I'm not responsible. The slave, he does something bad, you're on your own. And I'm telling everybody not to harbor the slave. If he's on your ship, you've got to turn him in. And you can tell sometimes by the value they put in the reward, whether they liked the slave or not, or wanted them back. If it was one old shoe reward, or whatever, they didn't value the slave much and didn't really want it back. But if you see $10, or in this case, is this the one where, let's see, it's maybe, £5, right? So he had some value. We'll see another one I think that's coming up that talks about even a higher one. This is Spencer Stafford. There were Stafford's Gazetteer, I think it was Stafford Solicitor Attorney in Middleburg. Says from the subscriber in the month of September, a Negro wench named Fan, age 30 years, 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high, stout, took with her an infant female of 9 months named Diana. She asked permission to visit her children in Schoharie County, which was granted her, but she took this method to run away. And they're offering a $10 reward, and if they bring her to an Albany jail, give them 25. That's a lot of money in those days. That's a lot of money. So they valued that slave very highly that it went away. We don't have many first-hand accounts of what it was like to be a slave in Schoharie County, or any that I've come across, but so we have to move up a little bit. In Montgomery County, we have the story of Reverend Thomas James, who wrote his biography. And he says, "I was born a slave at Schoharie in this state in the year 1804. I was the third of 4 children, and we were all the property of Aisha Kimball, who when I was in the 8th year of my age, sold my mother, brother, and sisters to purchasers from Smithtown, a village not far distant from Amsterdam in the same part of the state. My mother refused to go and ran into the garret, which we would call the attic, of the house to seek a hiding place. She was pursued, caught, tied, hand and foot, delivered to her new owner. I caught my last sight of my mother as they rode off with her. My elder brother and sisters were taken at the same time, never saw them again." Then he goes on to say, "My new master owned me about a few months when he sold me and traded me for a barter of a yoke of steers, a colt, and additional property." So this gives you a more close idea of what it was like to be a slave at that time. This is an interesting bill of sale that's on the table over there. This is from Palatine Bridge. We'll talk about, the progression of slavery, but basically it ended in New York in 1827, and this is dated 1822. So this sale, in other words, a slave was only good for 5 years, and then they're going to be free. So I think this one was like $75, but it's between Mr. Cottle of Palatine and Joshua Reed. And Joshua Reed is buying this slave for the 5-year term, and then the slave will be returned or set free. And what's interesting is Joshua Reed was the uncle of Susan B. Anthony, who was a suffragette and an anti-slavery advocate. And he was the one that got her the job at the Schoharie Academy, where she taught for a period of time, and there's a state marker there where that academy is located. We had gradual emancipation in New York. 1781, law of manumitting slaves in the armed forces. 1785, prohibiting importation. 1788, passed a law that they couldn't export or attempt to be exported, or they're made free. So basically, the laws of 1785 and 88 prohibited the slave trade into and out of New York. In 1799, an act of the legislature freed all the slaves born after July 4th. Males were continued to serve their master until age 28, females 25, and indentured servants 21. As part of the legislation, they allowed the slave owner to abandon his slave child to the poor master. So he could take the baby away from the mother, give it to the poor master, who was supposed to find a place for it, and the state would reimburse them a monthly fee for maintaining that slave child. So it was a way to compensate the slave owners for the loss of their slaves. In other words, when they had this law passed, you've got slaves here in New York, okay, a lot of slaves. And so there's, they're got to, in order to get the bill passed, they got to make the slave owners feel like they're not at a total loss. So they're going to be losing all these slave children. They're going to raise them possibly and then not be able to use them as slaves. So they allowed them to abandon the slave children. And you will find records of that in Cobleskill, for example, the town of Cobleskill records. I don't know if they still exist or not, but they did have records of paying the state money to the owner of the slave who had advertised that they were abandoning that particular slave child.
I'm sorry, where did the child go?
The child was abandoned to the poor master. In other words, every town had a poor master.
Who's a poor master?
It would be like your commissioner of social services, welfare, type of person, but at a local
So where did it go ultimately? Did it go to someone's home, like a foster child, or did it go like in a home?
It depended on whether they could find a place. A lot of times it went back to the owner because nobody wanted the black slave child. So they put it back to the owner, and then the owner would get that monthly fee until it became a big deal in the budget of the state, and they cut it out because they couldn't afford the amount that was costing. Graduates in 1817, Daniel Tompkins, who was governor of New York, was transferring. He was going to be the vice president of the United States. And he pushed the state legislature to pass an anti-slavery measure to end slavery, period, in New York. And they did take him up on that, and the law was passed, and all the slaves in New York were emancipated effective July 4th of 1827. What's interesting is Daniel Tompkins owned the property right over here. On the other side of the cemetery, beyond the woods, there's a stone house there that Daniel Tompkins owned. I don't know if he ever lived there or what the deal was, but he actually owned that property. The blacks in Schoharie, here they're having a meeting in 1846. What happened, if you'll notice there, he says that, let's see, there's going to be a speech for the amelioratory condition of the black race, a dissertation on the exorbitant duty imposed on wool may be expected from Moses Keeble, Esquire. Now, what that's talking about is that in 1821, before 1821, males had to own $100 worth of taxable property. Somewhere around 1819, there was some kind of a financial situation where a lot of the voters felt disenfranchised. They pushed through a legislation in 1821 at the Constitutional Convention that did away with that $100 requirement of taxable property that you had to own in order to vote. But if you were a black man, they added $250 worth of taxable property that you had to own in order to vote in the office. So, of course, this disenfranchised most of the black people. If you look at the population and you look at the number of black voters, you see it's a very, very small number that were able to overcome this $250 requirement. So what they're meeting about is there's going to be a New York State Constitutional Convention again. In other words, we had one in 1821, now we've got one in 1846. And basically they're getting together, as they are across the state, to petition to try and get the right to vote. Some of the blacks lived in log cabins. A lot of the areas in Schoharie that were populated by blacks was Sunnyside, which was up, where the apple orchard is on Schoharie Hill, Bridge Street, you go out that way and go on up there. And there was Sodom Road, that's why they called it Sodom, where the black people lived there. And then Spring Street in Schoharie was another area where there's a large black population. And then I discovered in the Sam Book there was also a population along Route 30 coming from the Apple Barrel on up the hill there into the Nisbert-Storff area. There was even there's black cemeteries around that are marked from these black settlers. Another thing that happened, even though the emancipation of the slaves in New York was in 1827, if a black slave that had been freed, or a freedman had decided to go south, there was a chance they might be re-enslaved in the South. A man by the name of Prince Mattice from Schoharie County was working aboard a ship. He had been in Schoharie County, I think it was Athens, Greene County, and then he got a job aboard a ship and got sick. And they left him on shore, on his own basically. And of course, being sick, he couldn't make revenue, couldn't, feed himself, take care of himself, so they put him in jail. So they were going to auction him off for his jail fees because he didn't have any money. So word got back to the people in Athens that, hey, Prince Matthijs, your neighbor there, he's down there, they're going to auction him off for the jail fees. So the jail fees were about $80, which, was quite a significant sum of money at the time. So they decided to go see the governor. Back in those days, you physically went in and saw the governor, right? And so they went to see the governor, but he was out of town. So they decided, hey, we'll get the money up amongst ourselves. And so they got the $80 amongst themselves, sent somebody down that knew Prince Matthijs, and got him released from jail and brought back. But because they had to pay this money out of their own pocket, and they wanted the state legislature to do it, they pushed them to pass legislation. And they passed legislation to protect this from happening again, so that the government would be responsible for bringing those people back that had been improperly detained in the southern states. And that law was passed before Solomon Northrop from Saratoga area was arrested and was confiscated. And he wrote that book, 12 Years a Slave. You may have heard of the movie. Well, that law that brought him back was the law that was passed because of the actions on Prince Matthijs' case. So the case law for Prince Matthijs was used to free Solomon Northrop. The churches fracture over abolition. Now, what you have to keep in mind is the federal government passed a lot of gag legislation. What was happening was, and you see some of this coming up, there were states coming into the Union, okay, and there were people that wanted them to be free and not slave states. Washington, D.C., they wanted to be free. So they continuously wrote these petitions to the federal government. And every time they did that, the southern states would react. And so eventually, to keep the waters calm, they basically passed a gag law in the federal legislature that any of these petitions were to go to this particular committee, basically a dead letter office where they said, we don't have the authority to act on this, and just shelved all those things so they didn't have to be brought up and everybody would get all upset. And so they kept the lid on the legislature that way. So the churches took that as a cue, to keep their churches stable. This is Gilbert McMaster, who was the pastor of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Waynesburg, and you'll see a copy of his work there. Basically, he was promoting the abolitionist movement within the church, and as such, they split. This is in 1832 and formed a different sect based on that issue. So the agitation in 1833 leads to the schism and the formation of the Reformed Presbyterian Church General Synod. So this is one of the early churches in the area that split. The Reformed Presbyterian Church is still active in Waynesburg. It's on Route 20. Congressman Briggs of Massachusetts was one of those that was active in this legislation on the federal level. Basically, what would happen, though, is this legislation had to be renewed every year. So that meant there was a window when these petitions could be brought before the legislature because the other one had expired and the new one hadn't been voted on. The churches fracture over abolition. This is the Lutheran Trinity Church of Stone Arabia. Now, the Lutheran Church here in Schoharie County played a unique role in the Lutheran Church of the United States in the way of the abolitionist movement. Reverend John D. Lawyer. Now, Reverend Lawyer was a lawyer. He was the county clerk of Schoharie County, and he decided he wanted to be a minister. So he was ordained, and this is Reverend Lintner, who is the preacher here in Schoharie, not the Schoharie Lutheran Church, and I think in Middleburg and Schoharie. He installed him as a full elder in the Lutheran Church. Now, what happened is that Lawyer was a very sharp guy, and so they put him in as the lead of the Hartwick Synod, which was the regional body of the Lutheran Church in this area. A group of them put a petition through to take a stand on slavery, and taking the cue from the federal government, the body said, well, let's just table that and put that aside. We don't want to go there. So what happened is the other members, including John D. Lawyer and several others, and what's interesting, they're all of the Schoharie Palatine type names like Ottman, Lawyer, you'll see those kinds of names. MP was another one. You'll see that these were old-time names that took upon themselves that the Lutheran Church should take a stand against slavery. And they had this convention in Forts Bush in Montgomery County and determined that they would form a new organization because the Hartwick Synod wouldn't look at their petitions and act on them. They felt they couldn't remain silent without sin. So they formed this Frankian Synod named after, I forget it was Otto Frank, what the guy's name was, but he was an abolitionist anyway. And they formed this new Frankian Synod. And again, this was Schoharie churches, Montgomery County churches, Rensselaer County churches, for the most part. Those were the areas that you found Frankian ministers. Now, Reverend John D. Lawyer published in the abolitionist newspaper, The Friend of Man, that they're important as being the first anti-slavery resolutions passed by that connection in Lutherans. The timely action of the Frankian Synod will be a matter of rejoicing to the friend of the oppressed. The ministers of this body, says Mr. Lawyer, are all abolitionists. This is the Lutheran Herald, the journal of the Frankian Synod that was published. They invited all the other Lutheran churches to take a stand on slavery, but nobody took them up on it. One of the interesting things is that this man here, Reverend Daniel Alexander Payne, was attending seminary at Gettysburg, where the Lutheran seminary is in Gettysburg. He was having some health issues or what have you, but the head of the college heard about this Frankian Synod being formed in Schoharie County and Montgomery and Rensselaer, and said, hey, you might go see those guys. They might give you a job preaching because they're an abolitionist group. So John D. Lawyer had been a teacher down in the South until they outlawed educating blacks there. And he came up and met with John D. Lawyer. John D. Lawyer, at the formation of the Frankian Synod, had been given the power to ordain ministers in between meetings of the Synod. And so he ordained Daniel Alexander Payne as a minister in the Lutheran Church. So here we have a black minister ordained here in Forts Bush, just in Montgomery County, by John D. Lawyer. So he's going to be preaching, but he's looking for a Lutheran church. So do you know of any black preachers in any of the white Lutheran churches around here? Okay. So he couldn't find a place to preach, right? So part of their area was Rensselaer County. So he went to Rensselaer County and he found that there is a church there. It's called the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church, or the African Presbyterian Church in Troy. And so he asked them, hey, would it be okay? These people I can preach to, I know they're Presbyterian, but really, so they appointed him like as a missionary to that church. He was very active in his time. He became, after serving there, he stayed with the Lutherans for a short period of time, and then he was afraid to join the African Methodist Episcopal Church because he was educated in a seminary. And in those days, the black churches praised their preachers that were not seminary. It was like one of the things they were proud of, that the preachers never attended a seminary. So he had something against him to begin with. He was a seminary graduate, and how was he going to get into the black churches? But eventually, they accepted him in the African Methodist Church. Down the road, he becomes the bishop in that organization, writes the history of that organization, and becomes the first black president of a black college.
What year was that again?
This is 1837 was when he was ordained. So 1839 or something like that. 1840, somewhere in that neighborhood is when he joined the AME Church. This is the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church in Troy. What happened to this church in 1863, you might remember there were draft riots in New York City. The Irish and the blacks were fighting, and basically they were afraid that the freed blacks were going to come up, the Emancipation Proclamation taking place. They were afraid these blacks were going to come to Troy and to New York City and take their jobs, so they ran all the blacks out of town, lynched them, hung them, burned them on lampposts. They did all kinds of nasty things to them. But they also did that in Troy. Troy had draft riots, and they had, again, a big Irish population of laborers. But they were going to burn this church, and the white preachers of the area stood in front of it and prevented them from burning the church down. This is Philip Whiting, again, one of the local Lutherans, who is active and wrote a book on his life. You might want to try and get that. He was in the Sharon Charge, and what was happening is that some of these churches that were Lutheran churches in the county, they didn't want to be a part of this new Frankian thing. They wanted to stay with the Hartwick Synod. So in some cases, like in this one, the churches revolted, and some of the members sued the Frankians and said, you're not really Lutherans. We're the Lutheran church. And so the courts decided in favor of the old Lutherans that were there, and so Whiting had to build a new church. It was not unusual. John D. Lawyer was in Sand Lake, and there ended up being two Lutheran churches in Sand Lake, Frankian and the Hartwick churches. This is Nicholas Van Alstyne. Van Alstyne was a leader in the Frankian church for a long time. John D. Lawyer was so eccentric that eventually they kicked him out of that synod too, because of his take on the Bible and other things that he did. But it was still an abolitionist at large. Nicholas Van Alstyne was a minister and also an agent on the Underground Railroad, used his name Paul. And he was also the unfortunate son of Schoharie County man who was hung for murder for the killing of Deputy Huddleston. You may have heard of that story. That was his father. 1836, now we're switching over to the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church is the same thing. We don't want you attending these abolitionist meetings. Keep a lid on it. Don't talk about slavery from the pulpit. We don't want that happening. So what they set up is the bishop would have basically spies. If you saw one of your fellow ministers go into an abolitionist meeting or doing something like that, you would squeal to the bishop, or at the next meeting, bring charges against them. So Reverend Luther Lee had that experience and decided with other ones that they needed to split from the Methodist Church and take an active stance against slavery and form the Wesleyan Methodist Church, which is the big church in Cobblestone now. It's Wesleyan Methodist. What's interesting about Luther Lee, he was born in Schoharie County. So we got a lot of things going on here. He moves to Syracuse in 1852, where he says he did the largest work of his life on the Underground Railroad. I passed as many as 30 slaves through my hands in a month. To get a taste of the issues of the day, the public lectures he held at the Schoharie Lyceum in 1839-43 had topics such as it's probable that the United States will dissolve, and should the abolitionists form a third party. The Dutch Reformed Church had their own crisis in 1855. Classes of Schoharie voted against the admission of North Carolina churches. And the Montgomery class took the opposite stand, that they didn't see anything wrong with accepting them into the fold. So who were these people locally that might have been active in the Underground Railroad? You know, how do we find out who these people are if they haven't left us much behind? So what you can find is that there were anti-slavery newspapers that were published that are still existent today. And they will have the meeting minutes of these anti-slavery meetings. This one is a town anti-slavery and Liberty Party. Liberty Party was formed as an abolitionist party and was had its own candidates and would support candidates that saw things their way. In 1836, an anti-slavery society was formed in Jefferson with Reverend Henry Boynton as the president, Adam Craig secretary, and Hiram Wheeler treasurer. In 37, in Fulton, you had A.P. Knox and organizing 40 members, and in 38, you see in Livingstonville, there's a formation with 100 members. Now, John Quincy Adams was one of those. In fact, he was the main rabble-rouser that was at the Congress that would bring up these petitions that came through. And he had the Journal of the House of Representatives is where you find the records of these petitions that came through and a list of where they're from. And so in between, when they hadn't banned the petitions yet, in between the votes, there's a record of Eli Bowles and 200 others inhabitants of Jefferson Schoharie County that put in petition. These petitions, again, were to stop states that were slave states from being brought into the Union, or were petitioning to have slavery outlawed in Washington, D.C. Another one was the John Plank, had 31 inhabitants of Schoharie County. Plank was the postmaster at Franklinton. Eli Bowles was a physician in Jefferson. So these are people that were circulating petitions in Schoharie County to free the slaves. This is the Lutheran Church, currently the Presbyterian Church in Schoharie, originally Lutheran Church. In this Lutheran church was Reverend George Lintner, whose diaries exist in Schoharie County. What's interesting is Reverend Lintner allowed some of the abolitionist preachers to actually preach in his pulpit, even though they stole some of his congregations. He was a Hartwick Synod leader, so he was the one that ordained John D. Lawyer, who now is on the other side of the fence. So even though these people were stealing his sheep, he still was open to the people that were promoting the anti-slavery cause. One of those people that was allowed to preach in his church was Reverend John Cross, who was a congregational minister and hired by the American Anti-Slavery Society to be an abolitionist at large, in other words, to be a lecturer, to do the lecture circuit. And he allowed him to preach in Schoharie. And it's interesting because in that, the diary, Reverend Lintner, he talks about how, these people have a good, good heart or whatever, but they do a lot of damage. He didn't really agree with everything the preacher had said, that day. So John Cross was looking to form a Schoharie County anti-slavery society. He had preached in some of the churches. He looked around, and eventually, like most people would think, he threw up his hands and he said, if abolitionism in Schoharie County isn't dead, it's sleeping, and he says, I believe it's dead, he says, and basically that, I'm not, we'll bury them and I'm not staying around for the funeral. That's what he said. So we can believe that based on the newspaper. You read the Schoharie Republican, which is a Democratic newspaper, very much anti-black sentiment throughout the paper. You can understand where that would come from, that there would be very much doubts that you could create an anti-slavery society here. But what happened was, he was about ready to give up, heading for Greene County, and he goes to the town hamlet of Livingstonville. And there he finds a little bit of leaven. There was a congregational minister there that was leading anti-slavery work. Here's a picture of the fort and some of the tombstones there. The area that he was heading down there was Greene County. So he formed an anti-slavery society here. Here's one of the churches in Livingstonville. You don't hear much about Livingstonville. So some of these places, it's based on their geographic location. A lot of the slaves we'll hear about, they came over to Rensselaerville in Albany County, and if you look just over the line, that's where Livingstonville is. So it makes sense, geographically. So we had these anti-slavery meetings, but the blacks also had their own anti-slavery meetings. We talked about the poster that we saw before, the hand-drawn one. This is Reverend Charles Ray. I don't know if he's related to the Rays of Cobleskill or not, but Reverend Charles Ray had a convention in Albany with people from all over New York, and I didn't know what it was about, so I read the article, and basically what they're meeting, I thought they were going to talk about slavery in the South and all this kind of stuff, and what they were talking about was getting the right to vote. That's what their meeting was about. So they said, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. So another meeting they had, they collected money for the captives that were the Amistad. You may have heard the movie The Amistads. One of the meetings they went to in Catskill, the money that was collected that day went to Mr. Tappan to help out the slaves that were about ready to be freed, they thought, by the Supreme Court. So here are some names that would be worth tracking to see who they are. These are officers in the Schoharie County Anti-Slavery Society. So one of the very prominent ones is Dr. James Marinas, who's very famous in Montgomery County for his work there in the anti-slavery movement. He lived in Leesville. You know where Leesville is? Sharon Springs, Route 20. Go beyond Sharon and you'll get to Leesville. Leesville also had a paper called I think the Something American, that was like an abolitionist type newspaper they had published there. Chester LaSalle, that name ring a bell to anybody here? Chester LaSalle? Now, Chester LaSalle owned LaSalle Hall, right? And where's LaSalle Hall? It's right on the corner of Spring Street. Where did the black people live? On Spring Street, right? Dr. Van Alstyne from Richmondville, now he's, we heard about the minister Van Alstyne, this is a relative of his. Mr. Gates from Schoharie, James Burnett, I think he was some kind of a county officer. David Bout from Cobleskill, last holiday was an attorney here in Schoharie. Sebastian Shank of Cobleskill, George Porter from Lawyersville, and a man named Samuel Codwell, who I was not able to find where they were from. But this gives you an idea. In Livingstonville, you have Deacon James Boyd. Now, Deacon Boyd is interesting. His father was a congressman from Schoharie County. And Congressman Boyd was also the largest slave owner in Middleburg. And according to the history, I forgot what was Roscoe said, he was noted for the kindness he showed his slaves. So his son becomes an abolitionist, but his father had been, the largest slave owner in Middleburg. In the organizing of the Underground Railroad, now we talked about the Underground Railroad as a term didn't get around until the 1840s. And basically, as we saw before, slaves were running away. They weren't waiting for the railroad. So what was the Underground Railroad but an organized way? In other words, is this any way to run a railroad before that term? So they were an organized way of getting slaves to freedom. So they formed organizations like we saw the town societies, county societies, and here we have a regional society going to be formed in the Northeast, led by Reverend Abel Brown, who had been an abolitionist, like Reverend Cross at large, was a lecturing preacher, but he got tired and stayed at the Baptist Church in Sand Lake for a little while. And then he got appointed to be the regional representative for this area. So he was the editor of the abolitionist paper, The Tocsin of Liberty, which is where the first reference to the Underground Railroad has been found. Charles Torrey was another one that was known as the father of the Underground Railroad, and they both held forth on the Capitol steps. It says in 1842, Torrey organized Underground Railroad group from Washington to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Albany. They solicited slaves in Washington to run away and then transported them north to Pennsylvania. They went to a series of safe houses, mostly owned by Quakers, to Philadelphia, Albany, and ultimately to Canada. Torrey and his colleagues rented horses and wagons and often transported as many as 15 or 20 slaves at a time. Torrey and Smallwood specifically targeted slaves owned by Southern members of Congress and important political figures to cause public disruption. So they were enemy number one in the South. So they were looking for this guy, right? So eventually, we'll see what happens. This is Miss Lawrence, Catherine Lawrence. We've got a marker for her out here in the cemetery. She worked as a missionary here on the hill. In other words, the Sloughters, anybody familiar with that term here in Schoharie County, they were, again, behind the courthouse up on the hill, as Sloughter Hill, they called it. Anyway, she had been teaching up there in a Sunday school, and she mentions there's a colored woman named Mary who was raised in the South, who appeared to have lived with a family of intelligence and refinement. So we find that some of these escaped slaves are staying here in Schoharie County. They're not necessarily, leaving right away. What happens in 1850, you have this fugitive slave law. Fugitive slave law says anybody here has got to help with an escaped slave. So, they thought, well, we're not safe in New York anymore, and a lot of them started going to Canada. We saw a little notation there where Bishop Payne was talking with about whether they should encourage their followers to go to Canada or not, because some of the abolitionist leaders had already, the black ones had already gone to Canada after the passage of the 1850 law. So Abel Brown was on his circuit preaching, and he stopped in Quaker Street, which is just over the border in Schenectady County. And he was planning there because they were going to have a meeting at Schoharie in the courthouse. Now, can you imagine having an abolitionist meeting in the courthouse here in Schoharie? But that's what was going to happen. And Lewis Washington, who was pictured here, was going to talk about his history as a slave. He had escaped slavery and was basically Abel Brown's sidekick at these meetings. And we're talking about what slavery was really like from the point of a slave. The thing was, Lewis Washington only talked about his history, where Abel Brown would promote the Liberty Party, okay? So he would promote the Liberty Party and their candidates at these meetings. So some people didn't like that. So a lot of these meetings were attacked by people from political parties that didn't agree with the Liberty Party candidates. So sometimes there was violence and things such as that happened at these meetings because of Abel Brown promoting a political agenda. Where if it was just Lewis Washington speaking about being a slave, they didn't mess with it. But if it was, they heard about political parties being discussed and that kind of thing, there could be rocks and stones and things happening. So we've noted some possible agents that are identified by historical reference, either Pastor Nicholas von Alstein, Dr. James Marinas, Deacon James Boyd. Deacon James Boyd moved out towards the Syracuse area, and when his wife died, in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, he said that she was a special friend of the slave. So we can imagine that they were close in supporting free slaves. It would not be surprising for the other Franklin pastors to follow the example of Reverend Allstein, the leader of that group for many years. Reverend Ottman's son was a leader in the anti-slavery societies around Harvard Cemetery. So you see Ottman, lawyer, you see all these familiar names. And John D. Laurier himself. In other words, just because he got removed from his position with the Franklin Synod, he still was publishing anti-slavery material. The anti-slavery groups, some of them split in 1840 because women were not allowed to speak at the meetings. They were supposed to listen and learn.